What if you were born to rule an empire, but the world saw you only as a woman? What if your father spent his entire life securing your throne, only for it to crumble the moment he died? What if you inherited an empty treasury, a broken army, and a pack of predatory neighbors waiting to tear your lands apart? This was the world Maria Theresa was thrown into. She wasn't supposed to succeed. She was supposed to be a footnote, the woman who lost the Habsburg inheritance. But she refused. She fought, she schemed, she reformed, and she endured. She didn't just hold her empire together, she remade it. Number 21. How did a piece of paper almost fail an empire? The state treasury held less than 100,000 florins when her father died. Some of the crown jewels had already been pawned. Her army had not won a significant battle in over 2 decades. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, spent nearly his entire reign convincing Europe to accept a document, not building an army to defend it. Her entire claim rested on a single piece of paper. It was called the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. Her father, Charles VI, had no surviving sons. This was a catastrophe for the Habsburg dynasty. For centuries, power had passed from father to son. The laws of many of their lands, like Bohemia and Hungary, did not recognize a female ruler. Charles knew this. He saw the storm coming. So he created a legal document. The Pragmatic Sanction stated 2 simple things. First, the Habsburg lands were indivisible. They could not be broken up and handed out to different relatives. Second, if Charles had no male heir, his eldest daughter would inherit everything. That daughter was Maria Theresa. This piece of paper became his life's obsession. He wasn't focused on military readiness. He wasn't focused on filling the treasury. He was focused on diplomacy. He traveled. He negotiated. He made concessions. He gave up territory and trading rights. He spent years, and a fortune he didn't have, getting every major power in Europe to sign on the dotted line. Spain signed, Russia signed, Great Britain signed, even France, the Habsburgs' oldest enemy, eventually signed. By the time Charles died in 1740, he believed he had secured his daughter's future. He thought the signatures of kings and emperors were a shield. He was wrong. They were just ink on parchment. The moment the news of his death spread, those promises evaporated. The Elector of Bavaria, Charles Albert, immediately laid claim to the throne. He had a convoluted claim through a previous Habsburg emperor. The Elector of Saxony, Augustus III, also made a claim. They saw a 23-year-old woman with no military or political experience. They saw an empty treasury. They saw an army in disarray. They saw an opportunity. They smelled weakness. Maria Theresa was in Vienna. She was pregnant with her first son, Joseph. She was in mourning for her father, and now she was surrounded. Her own ministers advised her to negotiate, to cede land, to buy peace. They told her she could not win a war. They looked at the same facts as her enemies and came to the same conclusion: the situation was hopeless. The Pragmatic Sanction, the document that was meant to be her salvation, had become a trigger for her ruin. It had lulled her father into a false sense of security. He had traded real power soldiers and gold for paper promises. And now the wolves were at the door, and all Maria Theresa had to defend herself with was the very document they were all ignoring. It was the ultimate lesson learned on her first day as ruler. Treaties are meaningless without the strength to enforce them. Number 20, could she even hold the throne for a week? She had never been trained to rule. Her father had her sit in on council meetings, but she was not allowed to speak. Her education was focused on singing, dancing, and etiquette, the typical training for a royal consort, not a sovereign. The ministers who had served her father were old, tired, and defeatist. They saw her as a girl, not a queen. On October 20th, 1740, Charles VI died. Maria Theresa was now the Archduchess of Austria, Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, and ruler of a vast collection of territories across Europe. But she held these titles in name only. Her power was an illusion. The state was bankrupt. The army numbered around 80,000 men on paper, but in reality, fewer than half were fit for combat. They were scattered, poorly equipped, and demoralized after a series of disastrous wars against the Ottoman Empire. Her first act as sovereign was to call a meeting of the Privy Council. The mood was grim. Count Zinzendorf, the state chancellor, laid out the bleak reality. The provinces were restless. The treasury was empty. The army was a shell. The advice from these seasoned politicians was unanimous compromise. They urged her to offer territory to her rivals, to appease them, to avoid a conflict she could not possibly win. They saw survival in surrender. Maria Theresa listened. She was young, inexperienced, and a woman in a world of powerful men. Every instinct for self-preservation should have told her to take their advice, but she didn't. She made a different choice. She stood before the council and declared her absolute refusal to cede a single village. She would not dismantle the inheritance her father had left her. She would fight for it. The old ministers were stunned. This was not the pliable girl they had expected. She immediately began working. She worked 12-hour days, poring over state documents she had never been allowed to see before. She met with generals, diplomats, and financiers. She discovered the true extent of the decay. The finances were in a worse state than she imagined. The military was a mess of corruption and incompetence. But instead of despairing, she became more determined. She wrote letters to the other European monarchs not as a victim begging for help, but as a sovereign demanding they honor their signed agreements. She appealed to their sense of justice and their legal obligations under the Pragmatic Sanction. Most of her letters were ignored or met with polite, non-committal replies. The world was waiting to see what would happen next. They did not have to wait long. Number 19, when your friend is your greatest enemy, what do you do? Frederick II of Prussia had written a book called Anti-Machiavel, a philosophical work denouncing cynical, power-hungry politics. He sent a copy to Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen. He portrayed himself as an enlightened, modern monarch, a man of his word. He was lying. In December 1740, just 2 months after Maria Theresa took the throne, the biggest blow fell. Came not from her declared rivals in Bavaria or Saxony, but from a supposed friend. King Frederick II of Prussia had inherited a full treasury and a highly disciplined, powerful army from his father. He was young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. His father had signed the Pragmatic Sanction. Frederick had no intention of honoring it. Without a declaration of war, without any warning, he marched 30,000 Prussian soldiers into Silesia. Silesia was the richest of all the Habsburg provinces. It was a hub of mining, weaving, and agriculture. Its tax revenues were crucial to the Habsburg economy. Frederick's invasion was a brutal act of aggression, a pure land grab motivated by greed. He offered Maria Theresa a deal surrender Silesia to him, and in return he would vote for her husband Francis Stephen to become Holy Roman Emperor. He would support her against her other enemies. He was offering to protect her from the fire he had started, but only if she gave him what he wanted. This was the ultimate test. Her ministers, again, begged her to accept the deal. Giving up Silesia, they argued, would neutralize Prussia, her most dangerous enemy. It would allow her to focus on the Bavarians and the Saxons. It was the pragmatic, logical choice. It meant survival. Maria Theresa's response was pure righteous fury. She was personally offended by Frederick's treachery. He was a hypocrite who wrote of honor while acting like a bandit. She saw his offer not as a deal, but as an insult. To her, this was not just about territory, it was about principle. If she gave in to the first bully who kicked down her door, what would stop the others? She would be presiding over the liquidation of her own empire. Her refusal was absolute. She wrote to her ambassador, "I am only a poor queen, but I have the heart of a king." She would not surrender Silesia. She would fight. This decision plunged her into the War of the Austrian Succession, a conflict that would last for 8 years and engulf all of Europe. Her small, unprepared army now had to face the most modern and disciplined military force on the continent. The first major battle at Mollwitz in April 1741 was a disaster for the Austrians. They were routed. The defeat seemed to confirm everything her ministers had feared. But for Maria Theresa, it only hardened her resolve. She had been betrayed, she had been attacked, now she would learn how to fight back. Number 18, could one desperate plea save a monarchy? The Hungarian nobility had a long history of resisting Habsburg rule. They were fiercely independent and guarded their ancient rights and privileges jealously. They paid almost no taxes to Vienna. They were not obligated to fight for the Habsburgs outside of Hungary's own borders. They had risen up in rebellion against her ancestors multiple times. By the summer of 1741, Maria Theresa's situation was dire. The Prussians held Silesia. A combined French and Bavarian army was advancing on Vienna. Her other rival, the Elector of Saxony, had joined the coalition against her. She had been abandoned by her supposed allies. Her treasury was gone. Her capital was threatened. It felt like the end. She had one last, desperate card to play Hungary. She traveled to Pressburg, modern-day Bratislava, the capital of the Kingdom of Hungary, to be crowned and to appeal to the Hungarian Diet, their parliament. This was a huge gamble. The Hungarian nobles were notoriously difficult. They could easily use her weakness to extract more concessions, or even switch sides and join her enemies. No one knew what they would do. On September 11th, 1741, she appeared before the assembled magnates. It was a piece of political theater, born of desperation and genius. She was dressed in traditional Hungarian mourning clothes, all black. She was 24 years old. According to the famous story, she held her infant son, the future Emperor Joseph II, in her arms. She addressed the Diet, not in German, the language of the court, but in Latin, the official language of Hungarian politics. She did not command them. She did not threaten them. She appealed to them. She spoke of her plight, of being abandoned by her friends and attacked by her enemies. She spoke of the threat not just to her, but to the Kingdom of Hungary itself. She presented herself not as their Austrian overlord, but as a queen in distress, a mother protecting her child. At the end of her speech, she held up her son, and some say she had tears in her eyes. The effect was electric. The hard-bitten, skeptical Hungarian nobles were moved. They forgot their old grievances. They saw a courageous young woman refusing to surrender. They rose to their feet, drew their swords, and famously declared, Vitam et sanguinem pro rege nostro, Maria Theresa, our life and blood for our king, Maria Theresa. They called her king, not queen, the highest possible honor, acknowledging her as a true sovereign ruler. This moment was the turning point. The Hungarians did not just offer words, they promised to raise an army of 100,000 men. This massive influx of fresh, fierce troops completely changed the strategic situation. The French and Bavarians, who had been advancing on Vienna, were forced to turn and face this new threat from the east. Maria Theresa had gambled everything on an emotional appeal to a group of people who had every reason to distrust her. And she had won. She had saved her throne not with a treaty or a bribe, but with sheer courage and a perfect understanding of her audience. Number 17, how do you accept losing the crown jewel of your lands? The War of the Austrian Succession cost the Habsburg monarchy over 100,000 soldiers. It also nearly doubled the state debt. Silesia, the lost province, had accounted for a quarter of the total tax revenue over German and Bohemian lands. Its loss was a permanent economic blow. The war dragged on for 8 long years. The Hungarian troops helped push back the French and Bavarians. Maria Theresa secured an alliance with Great Britain. Her armies fought in Italy, in the Netherlands, and in Germany. Her generals learned from their defeats. The Austrian army slowly became a more effective fighting force. She never stopped trying to retake Silesia from Frederick. But the Prussian king was a military genius, and his army was formidable. She launched multiple invasions of Silesia. All of them failed. By 1748, all sides were exhausted. The war had reached a stalemate. Peace negotiations began, leading to the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. The treaty was a bitter pill for Maria Theresa to swallow. On the one hand, it was a victory. The pragmatic sanction was upheld. Every signatory to the treaty finally officially recognized her as the rightful ruler of the Habsburg lands. They also recognized the imperial title for her husband, Francis Stephen, who had been elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1745. She had survived. She had held her inheritance together against all odds. Her main enemies, Bavaria and Saxony, had been defeated. But there was one huge loss. The treaty confirmed Prussia's possession of Silesia. This was the one thing she could not accept. For 8 years, the recovery of Silesia had been her primary war aim. Now, she had to sign a piece of paper formally giving it away. Her British allies, eager for peace, pressured her to accept the terms. She had no choice. Her state was financially ruined. Her people were tired of war. She signed the treaty, but she never, ever forgave Frederick. She referred to him in her private letters as the evil man. The loss of Silesia defined her. It was a constant, burning humiliation, but it also became her greatest motivation. The peace that followed the war was, for her, just an armistice. She spent the next 8 years completely reforming her state and her military with one single goal in mind: to build a government and an army strong enough to crush Frederick and take back her lost province. The defeat at the negotiating table in 1748 was the catalyst for the most sweeping and important reforms of her entire reign. She learned a hard lesson: a monarch's will means nothing without the power to enforce it. The next time she faced Frederick, she would be ready. Number 16, is it better to forgive or to win? The alliance between the Habsburgs of Austria and the Bourbons of France was so shocking to contemporaries that it was called a reversal of alliances. For over 250 years, the rivalry between these two great houses had been the defining feature of European politics. They had fought countless wars against each other. The idea of them fighting on the same side seemed impossible. After the War of the Austrian Succession, Maria Theresa took a hard look at the political map of Europe. Her traditional ally, Great Britain, had proven unreliable. The British were more concerned with their colonial rivalry with France than with helping Austria reclaim Silesia. They saw Prussia as a useful continental counterweight to French power. They were not going to help her fight Frederick. She needed a new, powerful ally. Her chancellor, Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, was a brilliant and forward-thinking diplomat. He had a radical idea. He argued that the real threat to Austria was no longer France. The world had changed. The real threat was the new, aggressive, and expansionist Kingdom of Prussia right on her northern border. Well, France and Austria no longer had major border disputes. Their old rivalry was a thing of the past. Their new common enemy was Frederick the Great. Kaunitz proposed the unthinkable, an alliance with France. Maria Theresa was skeptical at first. The hatred of the Bourbons was deeply ingrained in her. But Kaunitz was persuasive. He argued that only a powerful continental alliance could hope to contain Prussia. She eventually agreed. This was a stunning act of political pragmatism. She was willing to set aside centuries of dynastic hatred and tradition to achieve her primary goal: the destruction of Prussia and the recovery of Silesia. The negotiations were delicate and took years. To seal the new alliance, she would eventually betroth one of her daughters, Maria Antonia, better known as Marie Antoinette, to the future King of France, Louis XVI. This was the ultimate symbol of the new relationship. The diplomatic revolution of 1756 completely redrew the map of European alliances. The old system, with Austria and Britain fighting France, was gone. The new system pitted Austria, France, and Russia against Prussia and Great Britain. This diplomatic shift was Maria Theresa's doing, guided by Kaunitz. It showed her ability to abandon old prejudices in favor of cold, hard strategic calculation. She was not sentimental. She understood that in international politics, there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. And her primary interest was the humbling of Frederick the Great. This new, powerful coalition was the weapon she had been building for 8 years. Now, she was ready to use it. Number 15, can you reclaim what was stolen? The 7 Years' War involved every major European power and saw fighting in Europe, North America, India, and at sea. It is often considered the first true world war. For Austria, the war cost an estimated 140,000 military lives. Despite some victories, the war ended with Silesia still firmly in Prussian hands. In 1756, the war Maria Theresa had been preparing for finally began. It was, in many ways, a replay of the previous conflict, but on a much grander scale. This time, she was not the isolated, inexperienced girl. She was a hardened ruler with a reformed army and a coalition of the most powerful states in Europe at her back. France, Russia, Sweden, and Saxony were all allied with her against Prussia. Frederick was surrounded. His only significant ally was Great Britain, whose help was primarily financial and naval. On paper, Prussia should have been crushed within a year. The war started well for Austria and her allies. Her newly reformed army performed much better than it had in the 1740s. They won several key battles. The Russians advanced from the east, the French from the west, and the Austrians from the south. At one point, Russian troops even briefly occupied Frederick's capital, Berlin. Victory seemed within her grasp. The goal of retaking Silesia and breaking the power of Prussia for good felt tantalizingly close. But Frederick the Great earned his name during this war. He was a brilliant, audacious commander. He fought with incredible energy and skill, dashing his army from one front to another to defeat his enemies one by one before they could unite against him. He won stunning victories against overwhelming odds at battles like Rossbach and Leuthen. He bled, but he refused to break. The war dragged on for 7 brutal years. Maria Theresa's determination never wavered. She poured money and men into the conflict. She urged her allies on, coordinating strategy with Paris and St. Petersburg. But the coalition was clumsy and often poorly led. The French were distracted by their colonial war with Britain. The Russians were effective, but their policy was unpredictable. In 1762, the entire war effort fell apart for her. The Tsarina Elizabeth of Russia, a bitter enemy of Frederick, died. Her successor, Tsar Peter III, was a fervent admirer of the Prussian king. He immediately pulled Russia out of the war and made peace with Frederick. This was the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, and it saved Prussia from certain defeat. With Russia out of the war, the coalition collapsed. France, defeated by Britain overseas, was also looking for an exit. Maria Theresa was left isolated, unable to defeat Prussia on her own. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Hubertusburg. The treaty confirmed the pre-war borders. After 7 years of bloodshed and enormous expense, nothing had changed. Silesia was still Prussian. It was the most bitter defeat of her life. She had thrown everything she had at Frederick, and it was not enough. She had to finally accept that Silesia was gone forever. She wrote that the treaty brought her no joy, and that she felt ashamed to face her people. But from this second failure came a new resolve. If she could not defeat Prussia on the battlefield, she would defeat it by building a stronger, more modern, and more prosperous state. Number 14, how do you turn a broken army into a fighting force? Before her reforms, army officers often bought their commissions. Promotions were based on wealth and family connections, not merit. Soldiers were often recruited for life, turning the army into a sort of prison sentence. Supplies were handled by private contractors who were frequently corrupt, leading to shortages of food, uniforms, and ammunition. The defeat in the First Silesian War was a wake-up call. Maria Theresa knew that her army was not just beaten, it was broken. It was an old-fashioned aristocratic institution unfit for modern warfare. If the Habsburg monarchy was to survive, this had to change. Immediately after the war ended in 1748, she began the most radical military overhaul in Austrian history. First, she established a military academy, the Theresian Military Academy, in 1751. Its purpose was to train a new generation of officers based on talent and skill, not just noble birth. This was a revolutionary concept. While nobility still mattered, a path was now open for gifted commoners to rise through the ranks. The curriculum focused on modern strategy, engineering, and logistics. Second, she tackled the problem of recruitment and service. She introduced a system of cantonment, which was a form of limited conscription. Each region of the empire was now required to provide a certain number of recruits for its local regiment. Service was no longer for life, but for a fixed term. This made military service less terrifying for the peasantry and provided a steady stream of new soldiers. Third, she professionalized the entire support structure of the army. She created a central war ministry, the Hofkriegsrat, with real power to manage supplies, equipment, and finances. The old system of corrupt private contractors was replaced by a state-run supply system. This meant soldiers were better fed, better clothed, and better armed. Standardized uniforms and equipment were introduced across the entire army, improving both morale and battlefield efficiency. Fourth, she invested heavily in the artillery, recognizing it as the key to the modern battlefield. She brought in experts to design better cannons and to train her gunners in more effective tactics. By the time of the 7 Years' War, the Austrian artillery was considered one of the best in Europe, a dramatic improvement from the previous conflict. These reforms were not easy, They were expensive, and they were fiercely resisted by the old guard of the aristocracy, who saw their traditional privileges being eroded. But Maria Theresa pushed them through with relentless determination. She understood that a strong army was the foundation of state power. While her reformed army was not quite able to defeat Frederick the Great, it fought him to a standstill. It was a professional modern force that was unrecognizable from the dilapidated institution she had inherited. She laid the groundwork for the Habsburg army that would fight for the next 150 years. It's number 13, can you tame 1,000 nobles with paperwork? The Habsburg Empire was not a single unified country. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and counties, each with its own laws, customs, and powerful local nobility. The nobles in Bohemia, Hungary, and the Austrian Netherlands had a great deal of autonomy. They controlled local administration and tax collection, and they often worked against the interests of the central government in Vienna. Maria Theresa saw this as a fundamental weakness. How could she raise taxes efficiently or implement reforms when power was so decentralized? Her goal, after 1748, was to break the power of the regional nobles and centralize control in Vienna. This was a quiet, bureaucratic revolution, fought not with soldiers but with memos and new government departments. Her chief advisor in this was Count Friedrich Wilhelm von Haugwitz. He proposed a radical plan. Haugwitz wanted to separate judicial matters from political and financial administration. In 1749, he created a new central body, the Directorium in Publicis et Cameralibus. This was a mouthful, but its function was simple. It was a supreme administrative agency that took over the job of collecting taxes and running the government from the nobles. For the first time, royal officials loyal to Vienna were in charge of the day-to-day business of the state in most of her German and Bohemian lands. This was a direct assault on the power of the local diets and the aristocrats who dominated them. They had lost their most important function. To sweeten the pill, Haugwitz offered the nobles a deal. The central government would take over tax collection, but in return, it would guarantee a fixed, regular amount of revenue from the provinces for the next 10 years. This appealed to the nobles' desire for predictability and also ensured a steady flow of cash to Vienna to fund the army. This new centralized bureaucracy was more efficient and less corrupt. It allowed Maria Theresa to know exactly how much money her state had and to collect it reliably. She created a class of professional civil servants who owed their careers to her, not to a local duke. This administrative reform did not apply to Hungary, which retained its traditional autonomy, sent a concession she had to make to keep the powerful Hungarian nobility loyal. But in the core of her empire, she had fundamentally changed the nature of government. She had replaced a messy, feudal system with a modern, rational, centralized state. It was not glamorous work, but it was essential. She was building the machine that would allow her to project power both at home and abroad. Number 12, why was taxing the rich so revolutionary? For centuries, the burden of taxation had fallen almost exclusively on the peasantry and the residents of towns. The two most powerful classes, the nobility and the clergy, were almost entirely exempt from taxes. Their wealth was based on land, and that land was considered untouchable by the state's tax collectors. This system was not just unfair, it was also incredibly inefficient. The greatest sources of wealth in the kingdom were contributing nothing to its defense or administration. Maria Theresa knew this had to change. The state was desperate for money to fund her new army and bureaucracy. The old tax system was simply not adequate for the needs of a modern state at war. After the War of the Austrian Succession, she and her advisor Haugwitz made a truly radical decision. They were going to make the nobles and the clergy pay taxes. This was a seismic shock to the established order. The nobility's tax exemption was a core part of their identity, a symbol of their superior status. Where they fought back fiercely, they argued that it was their ancient right. They claimed that they already served the state with their blood on the battlefield, so they should not have to serve it with their money. The clergy made similar arguments based on the church's special divinely ordained status. Maria Theresa was unmoved. Her piety was deep and sincere, but she also believed the church had a duty to support the Christian state that protected it. Her view of the nobility was even more practical. If they wanted the state to protect their lands and titles, they had to contribute to the cost of that protection. She was not trying to destroy the aristocracy, but to make it a functional part of the state. The process was difficult. It involved years of tough negotiations with the regional diets. She did not impose a universal income tax. Instead, her government undertook a massive project to survey and classify all the land in the empire, including land owned by the church and the nobility. Taxes were then assessed based on the value and productivity of the land. It was a property tax, and for the first time, everyone who owned property had to pay it. The amounts were not huge at first, but the principle was revolutionary. It established the idea that all subjects of the crown, regardless of their social status, had an obligation to contribute to the state. It broke a feudal privilege that had stood for 1,000 years. This reform not only brought in huge amounts of new revenue, but it also fundamentally changed the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. It was a major step towards a more modern and equitable society, driven not by abstract ideals of fairness, but by the cold, hard necessity of paying for a bigger army. Number 11. What happens when you teach peasants to read? Across most of Europe in the 18th century, education was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and the clergy. The vast majority of the population was illiterate. Peasants were not expected to read or write, they were expected to farm. This was seen as the natural order of things. Many nobles and officials believed that educating the lower classes was a dangerous idea. It might give them ambitions above their station. It could lead to social unrest. Maria Theresa had a different view. She was a devout Catholic and believed that her subjects should be able to read the Bible and the Catechism. But her reasons were also deeply practical. She was building a modern, centralized state. That state needed literate soldiers who could read orders, bureaucrats who could keep records, and skilled workers who could improve the economy. An ignorant population was a barrier to progress. In 1774, she issued the General School Regulation, one of the most transformative acts of her reign. This decree established a comprehensive, state-run system of primary education. It made school attendance compulsory for all children, both boys and girls, from the ages of 6 to 12. This was an absolutely radical concept for its time. No other major state in Europe had anything like it. The reform set up a three-tiered system. At the bottom was the trivial schule, a basic primary school in every parish and village. These schools would teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, along with religion and morality. Above that were the Hauptschulen in the larger towns, which offered more advanced subjects like Latin, geography, and history. At the top were the Normalschulen, which were teacher training colleges designed to produce a steady supply of qualified educators for the new system. Implementing this was a massive undertaking. The state had to fund the schools, print standardized textbooks, and train thousands of teachers. There was resistance. Some peasants needed their children to work on the farm. Some nobles and clergy were suspicious of state-controlled education. But Maria Theresa and her ministers pushed it forward. The long-term effects were profound. While the system was not perfectly implemented overnight, it dramatically raised the literacy rate across the Habsburg lands over the next few generations. It created a more skilled workforce and a more capable pool of military recruits. It also fostered a greater sense of a shared Austrian identity, as children across the diverse empire began learning from the same books. By investing in the education of her people, Maria Theresa was investing in the future strength and stability of her state. She understood that a nation's greatest resource is its people. Number 10, would you risk your own children's lives for science? Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases of the 18th century. It was highly contagious and deadly. It killed an estimated 400,000 Europeans every year. Those who survived were often left with deep, disfiguring scars. It struck all classes, from the poorest peasant to the royal families. Several of Maria Theresa's own relatives had died from the disease. A controversial new medical procedure offered a glimmer of hope: inoculation, or variolation. This was not a vaccine as we know it today. It involved deliberately infecting a healthy person with a small amount of pus taken from a mild case of smallpox. The hope was that this would induce a much less severe form of the disease, leaving the person immune to future infection. But it was risky. The procedure could sometimes trigger a full-blown fatal case of smallpox. Many doctors were against it, and the public was deeply suspicious. It was seen by some as unnatural and dangerous. Maria Theresa was initially hesitant, but in 1767, a smallpox epidemic swept through Vienna and hit the imperial family hard. She herself caught the disease and barely survived. Two of her teenage children, Maria Josepha and Maria Johanna, were not so lucky. They both died. The grief-stricken empress decided she had to act. She brought in Dutch physician Jan Ingenhousz, a proponent of inoculation. She listened to his arguments. She weighed the risks. Then she made a courageous decision. She would not just promote the new procedure, she would lead by example. In 1768, she had her own younger children inoculated. This was an incredible act of faith in a new, unproven medical science. She was risking the lives of her own family in a very public way. If any of them had died from the procedure, it would have been a personal and political disaster. Thankfully, the inoculations were successful. Her children developed mild symptoms and then recovered, now immune to the disease. The effect of this royal endorsement was immediate and powerful. If inoculation was safe enough for the Empress's children, it was safe enough for everyone. Maria Theresa ordered the construction of a special inoculation house in Vienna and offered the procedure free of charge to the public. She launched a public campaign to overcome fear and suspicion. Her personal example helped to popularize inoculation across Austria and much of Europe, saving countless lives. It was a moment where she put aside tradition and fear and chose to trust science for the good of her people. Number 9, can you be a monarch and a wife? Royal marriages in the 18th century were almost always political contracts. They were used to seal alliances, acquire territory, and ensure dynastic succession. Love was rarely a consideration. A monarch's duty was to the state, and their marriage was just another tool of statecraft. Maria Theresa's own marriage was supposed to be a typical political arrangement. Her husband was Francis Stephen of Lorraine. He was chosen for her because his duchy could be traded away to satisfy French ambitions, smoothing the diplomatic path for the pragmatic sanction. It was a politically convenient match. But something unexpected happened. They fell genuinely and deeply in love. Their marriage was a true partnership, a remarkable exception in the world of royal politics. Maria Theresa was the sovereign ruler of the Habsburg lands. Francis was her consort. This could have been an awkward, difficult arrangement, but they made it work. She adored him, calling him her mouse or dear mouse in her letters. He, in turn, respected her power and intelligence, acting as a loyal advisor. She made sure he was not just a powerless figurehead. After a long campaign, she secured his election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1745, giving him the highest title in Germany. This elevated his status and satisfied his own ambitions. While she held the real power in the Habsburg lands, he took the lead in managing the family's finances. Francis was a shrewd businessman. He invested wisely and managed the imperial estates with great skill, eventually amassing a huge personal fortune that he used to help pay off the state's massive debts. He was, in effect, her finance minister. Their relationship was not without its tensions. Francis had a wandering eye, and his infidelities caused Maria Theresa great pain. But their fundamental bond of affection and respect never broke. They had 16 children together, and their family life, while lived in the public eye of the court, was marked by genuine warmth. So when Francis died, suddenly in 1765, Maria Theresa was utterly devastated. Her grief was profound and lasted for the rest of her life. She cut off her hair, dressed only in black, and draped her rooms in black cloth. She withdrew from many of the social aspects of court life. But she never stopped being the empress. She continued to rule, to work, to reform. Her love for Francis was a central part of her life, but she never allowed her personal feelings, even her overwhelming grief, to interfere with her duty to the state. She proved that it was possible to be both a devoted wife and a powerful, effective ruler. Number 8. Are your children your legacy or your pawns? Maria Theresa gave birth to 16 children, 11 daughters, and 5 sons. This was an astonishing number even for the time. In an age of high infant mortality. 13 of them survived into adulthood. She was a devoted and often controlling mother. She wrote detailed instructions for their governors and tutors and worried constantly about their health, their education, and their moral character. She referred to her family as her little flock. But she was also the empress of a great European power. And in the 18th century, the children of a monarch were a key diplomatic asset. Maria Theresa used her children's marriages to build alliances, secure peace, and extend Habsburg influence across the continent. Her daughters became a crucial part of her foreign policy. It was a cold, calculated strategy that she pursued with the same determination she brought to all matters of state. She called it her marriage go-round. One daughter, Maria Amalia, was married to the Duke of Parma in Italy, strengthening Austrian influence there. Another, Maria Carolina, was sent to marry the King of Naples, a notoriously difficult man. She became the de facto ruler of the kingdom and a staunch ally of her mother. The most famous of these matches was for her youngest daughter, Maria Antonia, who was sent to France to marry the heir to the French throne. This marriage sealed the new and fragile alliance between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. We know her today as Marie Antoinette. These marriages were often not happy. Maria Amalia grew to resent her mother's political maneuvering. Maria Theresa herself knew the sacrifices she was asking of her daughters. She wrote long letters to them after they were married, full of advice on how to be a good wife, how to win influence at their new courts, and how to serve the interests of the Habsburg dynasty. She expected them to be her ambassadors. She was both a loving mother and a ruthless political strategist. She wept when her children left Vienna for their new homes, but she never wavered in her belief that their dynastic duty came first. Her children were her personal legacy, but they were also instruments of the state. This dual role of mother and empress defined her life. She populated the courts of Europe with her offspring, creating a network of family ties that helped to stabilize the continent for a generation. It was a deeply personal form of power politics. Number 7, what happens when your heir thinks you're obsolete? In 1765, Maria Theresa's beloved husband, Francis Stephen, died. According to the laws of the Holy Roman Empire, their eldest son, Joseph, immediately succeeded his father as emperor. Maria Theresa also made him co-regent of the Habsburg lands. She was still the sovereign, but she wanted to train her son to rule and to share the burdens of government. It turned out to be one of the most difficult and stressful periods of her life. Maria Theresa and Joseph were polar opposites. She was a devout Catholic, conservative, and pragmatic. She believed in slow, careful reform that respected tradition. Joseph was a true child of the Enlightenment. He was impatient, idealistic, and radical. He admired her great enemy, Frederick the Great. He believed in sweeping away old institutions and building a new, perfectly rational state from scratch. He saw his mother's piety as superstition and her caution as weakness. Their co-regency was a constant battle. They clashed over almost every issue. Joseph wanted to grant religious toleration to Protestants, and Jews. Maria Theresa, a staunch Catholic, was horrified by the idea. Joseph wanted to abolish serfdom in a single stroke. She feared it would lead to social chaos and ruin the economy. He wanted to reform the church, seizing monastic lands and putting priests under state control. She saw this as a sacrilegious attack on God. They argued constantly, both in person and in long, passionate letters. Joseph would propose a radical new reform. Maria Theresa would veto it. Joseph would threaten to resign. Maria Theresa would plead with him to be patient. She wrote, "We are a strange family. The head is and remains Catholic, while my son, the body, is an unbeliever." It was a generational conflict at the very heart of the empire. She knew that he was the future. She tried to moderate his radicalism, to teach him prudence. But she also recognized his intelligence and his genuine desire to improve the lives of his people. She allowed some of his reforms to go through, especially in the military and in administration. But on the big issues like religion and the fundamental structure of society, she held the line. This constant conflict took a heavy toll on her. She loved her son, but she feared that his radical ideas would destroy the very empire she had spent her life fighting to preserve. For the last 15 years of her reign, she was engaged in a political and ideological war with her own heir. It was a frustrating and often painful struggle, but it also showed her enduring strength. Even in her later years, she would not be pushed aside. She ruled to the very end. Number 6, can you be a moral ruler and a pragmatic one at the same time? Poland in the 18th century was a large but weak kingdom. It had a unique political system where the king was elected by the nobility, who were fiercely independent and often paralyzed the government. Its powerful neighbors Russia, Prussia, and Austria had been meddling in Polish affairs for decades. By the 1770s, Poland was essentially a failed state, unable to defend itself. In 1772, Frederick the Great of Prussia came up with a cynical plan. He proposed that the three great Eastern powers should simply help themselves to Polish territory to avoid fighting a war with each other over other issues. Russia's Catherine the Great was enthusiastic. This was a chance for them to expand their empires at the expense of a weak neighbor. They needed Maria Theresa to agree. She was horrified by the idea. She was a traditionalist who believed in the legitimacy of monarchs and the sanctity of borders. The idea of carving up another country in cold blood without any legal justification offended her deeply. It was, she said, immoral. She saw it for what it was, a gangster's pact. She wrote, "She is a good neighbor and a friend, this unfortunate Poland. To despoil a state that has no power to defend itself is an act of injustice and treachery." But she was under immense pressure. Her son Joseph and her Chancellor Kaunitz both urged her to participate. Their argument was purely pragmatic. If Austria stood aside on moral grounds, Russia and Prussia would simply take larger shares for themselves, and Poland was going to be partitioned anyway. By refusing to join, Austria would gain nothing and would simply be weaker relative to its two great rivals. It was a classic problem of realpolitik. For months, Maria Theresa resisted. She argued, she protested, she wept. But in the end, she gave in. She agreed to take part in, what became known as the First Partition of Poland. Austria annexed the southern region of Galicia. It was a rich and populous territory, a valuable addition to her empire. But she was deeply ashamed of her decision. Legend has it that she said, "She weeps, but she takes." It perfectly captured her internal conflict. She signed the treaty, but she wrote on her copy that it was a blot on her entire reign. The partition of Poland showed the limits of her power and the brutal realities of 18th century politics. She was a moral person forced to make an immoral choice for the sake of her state's security. It was a decision that haunted her for the rest of her life. Number 5, how do you write one? Set of rules for a dozen different peoples. The Habsburg lands were a legal mess. Each kingdom and province had its own ancient legal code, its own judicial system, and its own traditions. And a crime in Austria might be treated completely differently than the same crime in Bohemia. The laws were often a confusing jumble of Roman law, local custom, and feudal privilege. Justice was slow, unpredictable, and often brutal. Maria Theresa saw this legal chaos as another obstacle to creating a unified, modern state. She wanted a single, rational, and humane legal system for all her German and Bohemian lands. This was an incredibly ambitious project. It meant replacing centuries of tradition with a new, unified code of law. Beginning in the 1750s, she commissioned a group of legal experts to create this new code. The work took over a decade. The result was the Codex Theresianus, completed in 1766. It was a massive document, a comprehensive attempt to standardize all civil law, from property rights to contracts. It was a remarkable achievement of legal scholarship, written in clear, concise German rather than the traditional Latin. The code was intended to make the law more predictable and accessible. It aimed to create a system where justice depended on a clear set of written rules, not on the whim of a local lord or judge. However, the Codex Teresianus was so detailed and complex that Maria Theresa herself thought it was too academic and impractical. It was never officially put into effect in its original form, but it was not a failure. It served as the foundation for future legal reforms. The work continued, and parts of her code were later incorporated into the Austrian Civil Code of 1811, which remains the basis of Austrian civil law to this day. She also turned her attention to criminal law. The existing system, the Constitutio Criminalis Teresiana, was published in 1768. It was a mixed bag. On the one hand, it was a step forward because it standardized criminal procedures across her lands, ending some of the arbitrary cruelty of local courts. On the other hand, it still reflected the harshness of the era. It retained practices she later came to oppose. Her attempts to reform the law showed her deep-seated belief in order, reason, and the power of the state to create a more just society, even if the process was slow and difficult. Number 4, why did she care so much about public virtue? Maria Theresa was intensely religious. Her Catholic faith was the bedrock of her life. She believed that as a ruler, she was responsible not just for the material well-being of her subjects, but also for their moral and spiritual health. This belief led her to some of the most controversial policies of her reign. She was deeply concerned about what she saw as the declining moral standards of her time, especially in a large city like Vienna. She believed that things like adultery, prostitution, and even public flirting were sins that offended God and threatened the social order. She decided to use the power of the state to enforce her strict moral code. She created a Castity Commission, Commission. This was, in effect, a state-run morality police. Its agents, often plainclothes officers, would patrol the streets of Vienna looking for any signs of immoral behavior. They would raid balls, inns, and private homes. They arrested couples who were out together unchaperoned. They cracked down on gambling and lavish clothing. Men and women accused of adultery or other moral offenses could be arrested, publicly shamed, or even exiled. These policies were deeply unpopular. The Viennese resented the state snooping into their private lives. The nobility, in particular, felt that their traditional freedoms were being violated. Even her own son, Joseph, thought the Chastity Commission was an absurd and tyrannical overreach of state power. He argued that the state had no business policing the private morality of its citizens, but Maria Theresa was adamant. She saw a direct link between public virtue and the health of the state. A morally upright population, she believed, would be more hardworking, more obedient, and more blessed by God. Her morality police were an extension of her role as the mother of her country. She was trying to protect her children from sin. These policies show a side of her that is very different from the pragmatic reformer. They reveal a deeply conservative and devout woman, shaped by the Baroque piety of her youth. Her attempts to enforce public morality may seem intrusive and intolerant to us today, but for her they were a sacred duty. It was a clear example of her belief that a ruler's job was to govern every aspect of her subjects' lives. Number 3, how does an empress cope with a broken heart? On August 18th, 1765, Maria Theresa's world fell apart. She and her husband, Emperor Francis Stephen, were in Innsbruck for the wedding of their son Leopold. After returning from the opera, Francis suddenly collapsed and died of a stroke. They had been married for almost 30 years. Maria Theresa's grief was immediate and all-consuming. It was not the stylized, formal mourning of a typical monarch. It was the raw, desperate grief of a woman who had lost the love of her life. She did not just mourn him, she transformed her entire existence into a memorial for him. From the day he died until her own death 15 years later, she wore only black. She gave away all her colorful dresses and lavish jewelry. She had the room where he died in Innsbruck converted into a chapel. In her palace in Vienna, she redecorated her own rooms entirely in black and gray lacquer with somber paintings. She spent hours every day in prayer for his soul. She referred to herself in her letters as "your old, sad mother," and dated them by how long it had been since she was a happy wife. This profound grief changed her. She withdrew from the glittering social life of the court, the balls, the concerts, the theater that she had once enjoyed. Her public persona became much more somber and severe. She became the Empress Dowager, a figure in black, a living symbol of widowhood. But it is crucial to understand what she did not do. She did not stop ruling. She did not hand over power to her son, Joseph. The day after Francis's death, she was back at her desk, working. She continued to manage the affairs of her vast empire with the same diligence and attention to detail as before. She simply did it while consumed by personal sorrow. Her grief became a source of strength, in a way. It reinforced her image as the dedicated, self-sacrificing mother of her people. She had lost her personal happiness, so now her only devotion was to her state and her subjects. Her last years were marked by constant conflict with her son, and by the deep regret she felt over the partition of Poland. But she never faltered in her duties. Her ability to compartmentalize her overwhelming personal pain from her public responsibilities was perhaps the ultimate proof of her incredible discipline and sense of duty. She ruled through her tears. Number 2. What does a building say about its builder? When Maria Theresa came to the throne, Schönbrunn was a relatively modest hunting lodge outside Vienna. It was her father's creation, but it was far from the grand imperial residence it would become. Maria Theresa had a deep personal connection to the place. It was one of her favorite retreats. After the turmoil of the War of the Austrian Succession, she decided to transform it. Schönbrunn Palace became her great project, the architectural embodiment of her reign. She poured vast sums of money into expanding and redecorating it. She was not just a patron, she was intimately involved in the planning. She worked closely with her architect, Nicolaus Picassi, on every detail. The palace that emerged was not a copy of Versailles, the dominant model of the time. It had its own distinct character. While the exterior was a grand imperial statement, the interior was designed for a different purpose. And Schönbrunn was built to be both a seat of power and a family home. Yes, it had the magnificent staterooms, like the Great Gallery, designed to impress visiting dignitaries with the wealth and power of the Habsburg dynasty. But it also had dozens of smaller, more intimate rooms where she, Francis, and their 16 children could live. The famous yellow facade, which became known as Theresian yellow, gave the massive building a warm, almost cheerful appearance. The palace and its vast gardens were a reflection of her values. The gardens were not just for pleasure, they included a botanical garden for scientific study and the Tiergarten Schönbrunn, the oldest continuously operating zoo in the world, founded in 1752. This reflected her interest in science and the Enlightenment. The Gloriette, a grand structure on the hill overlooking the palace, was dedicated to the concept of a just war, a monument to those who had fought and died to preserve her empire. Every aspect of Schönbrunn told a story about its creator. It was grand, but also practical. It was a symbol of imperial majesty, but also a space for family life. It was a center of political power that also embraced science and nature. In transforming a hunting lodge into one of Europe's great palaces, Maria Theresa was doing more than just building. She was creating a physical manifestation of her own complex identity, empress, reformer, mother, and matriarch of a new, more modern Austria. Number 1, did she save the Habsburg Empire or just delay its fall? Maria Theresa died on November 29th, 1780. She was 63 years old. She had reigned for 40 years. On her deathbed, she was still working, giving last instructions to her son, Joseph. Her final years were filled with worries about him, about the future of her family, and about the empire she had fought so hard to protect. So, what was her final legacy? The woman who inherited a bankrupt state and a shattered army left behind an empire that was solvent, centralized, and defended by a professional military. The young girl who no one thought could rule had become the most powerful woman in Europe, the respected mother-in-law of Europe. She had introduced sweeping reforms in administration, law, education, and public health that fundamentally modernized her state and improved the lives of her subjects. She had faced down Frederick the Great, and while she never recovered Silesia, she had fought him to a standstill and prevented him from dismantling her empire. She had held together a diverse and fragile collection of territories through sheer force of will. She created a professional civil service, made the nobility pay taxes, and established a system of universal primary education that was decades ahead of its time. But there were also limits to her vision. She was a product of her time, a devout and often intolerant Catholic who resisted religious freedom. She was an absolutist monarch who believed in her divine right to rule, not in popular sovereignty. Some of her reforms were incomplete. She failed to integrate Hungary fully into her centralized state, a problem that would plague her successors. And the empire she left behind was still a complex, multi-ethnic entity facing the rising tides of nationalism that would eventually tear it apart more than a century after her death. Did she save the Habsburg Empire? In the short term, absolutely. When she came to the throne in 1740, its collapse seemed imminent. When she died in 1780, it was stronger, more stable, and more powerful than it had been in a century. She gave it a new lease on life. She was not a revolutionary. She was a pragmatist. She did not seek to overturn the old order, but to strengthen and preserve it by reforming its weakest parts. She was the great matriarch who repaired the foundations of an ancient house, allowing it to stand for another 140 years. That, in itself, was a monumental achievement.